As Ryan said, my name is Isabel Kwan, and I'm a Phase 2 student veterinarian at the Ontario Veterinary College, as well as the poultry industry representative and one of the incoming co-presidents of the college's Food Animal Club. I want to take a minute to tell you about this club, as every year it gives over 200 student vets opportunities to learn practical skills outside of the classroom, such as on-farm euthanasia of poultry, as well as other skills relevant to veterinarians in the beef, dairy, and swine industries, in the hopes that one day we will positively impact the future of food animal medicine in Canada. If any of our speakers or attendees would be interested in doing a presentation for the Food Animal Club or helping supervise a workshop related to poultry medicine, I'm here all day, so please don't hesitate to come and find me. And with that, I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Mike Petrik. Mike has been a full-time laying hen veterinarian with the McKinley Hatchery for 19 years. He has a master's from the University of Guelph in animal welfare. He's actively involved in provincial and national programs for laying hen medicine and poultry welfare. Aside from work, Mike keeps out of trouble by traveling, playing hockey, chasing two busy kids, and running obstacle races.
Thank you. So good news. First, we're moving to a much more interesting species than the broilers we've been talking about all day. And second of all, I'm not going to use any of the big words that Marina did because, first of all, she used up the whole quota, and second of all, I don't know what they mostly mean. So, moving on to laying hens. The interesting part, there we go, about laying hens is that they have two distinct lives. So we start them off as day-old chicks in a pullet house. And then once they become sexually mature, they become laying hens. And then we move them into a new facility with different housing, and we start them again. So I'm going to talk mostly about starting chicks because that's the first 7 days. But the first 7 days in the laying house is also an important transition time for these birds, and we need to pay attention to those too. So this could easily be 2 talks, but we're going to talk about just putting in the little yellow chicks and starting them from there. The interesting thing about restarting these birds, or even when we start day-old chicks, similar to broilers but much more complicated, is that laying hens go into a much more complicated and intricate environment than broiler chicks do. Broilers, for the most part, go onto a flat, single floor, and have feed and water around them. Whereas laying hens will go into more of an elaborate place with perches and different feeding systems, different place for them to travel to, and so it's a little bit more of a risky event because it's not as controlled or not as simple. Similar to the broiler chickens, we have to pay attention to the feed, lighting, air, water, sanitation. We have to look after their basic biological needs, and we have to make them comfortable. Again, they don't control their own body temperature any better than broiler chicks do. And they're also at real risk of drying out. So if we have too low of a humidity, it definitely puts a lot more pressure on the birds drinking enough and having very quick access to water. So we pay attention to the humidity of the barns. What's new with starting day-old chicks, so this is what's happened maybe over the last decade, maybe a little less, maybe 5 or 6 years. We've started doing day-old beak treatment. So up until maybe 8 years ago, the method for blunting the beak of day-old chicks was to use a hot blade, which would cauterize the wound that was made by cutting them. This is necessary because chickens are generally not very friendly to each other. They have a definite hierarchy, they have a pecking order, it's called that for a reason. And birds left with a fully sharpened beak are at far higher risk of causing real serious health and welfare issues later on in life. So to control that, we want to blunt the beak off, and we still do. We still need to, even though genetics have come quite a ways to making the birds play nicer in the sandbox. So we've got new technology with that. We're starting to do more vaccination for coccidiosis at day old. We used to use antibiotics to prevent, or anticoccidials to prevent their exposure, especially when birds were in cages. If you can keep them away from their manure for the first couple weeks, then they really had no access to cocci for the rest of their lives. So if we could keep them basically more or less sterile, then we could get away with never having to have them gain immunity or have to treat them. Now with them growing up in more complicated aviaries and furnished cage systems, that's not enough. So now we've started to work with cocci vaccines. We've got the new housing system. So again, if you're going to house a laying hen in an aviary system, you must raise her in an aviary type system. If you don't, she will not be able to climb. She won't be able to find feed and water. And we've seen some real disasters where chicks were grown either on a flat floor or in cages and then moved to an aviary system, didn't understand how to navigate the playground, and we had some real serious health issues because of that. We've got new light technology, which isn't something we think about very much. Scott mentioned about intensity, but with laying hens, because we're stimulating them to come into production, and that's light controlled, there's a lot more. Color is important. Flicker rates are important. So it's intensity, but it's also 2 or 3 other moving parts. And so you can have a whole lot of combinations that do and don't work depending on how they come together. And then there's always disease challenges. So day-old beak treatment, for anyone who isn't familiar with laying hens or laying pullets at day-old, that's what they look like with their little sharp needle there. And the bottom left picture is what a chick looks like at day 1 or day 2 leaving the hatchery. So we use infrared light to kill the beak cells, and it's not that different than laser hair removal or laser tattoo removal. You are targeting with infrared light the pigmented cells in the beak. It causes them to heat up, and it causes them, or not to heat up, not physically heat up, but it causes them to become damaged, and then they just die. They just don't grow anymore. And you can see there on the bottom right, this is a bird about 7 to 10 days old that has been pecking around in her environment, and you can see the top beak is worn off, the bottom one has not yet. It still will. So then you'll have a blunt front of that bird. So it's very much less of an impact on the birds. There's been tons of research showing how there are no neuromas formed, or very few neuromas formed compared to hot blade treatment. And obviously the activity itself is not painful. They've shown that pecking rates and the approach to feed is no different than non-beak trim birds. So this is a big jump forward in animal welfare, and it still allows us to control that cannibalism and interbird aggression later on. Coccidiosis vaccine, it's given a day of age of the hatchery. The interesting thing about cocci vaccines is that you cannot make a bird immune by giving them a vaccine. It's a start. It's a cascade. So the oocyst will come into the bird, sporulate, and then come out of the bird in the manure, and they have to eat that again. And if you don't know the day-to-day workings of chickens, if they can find manure in the environment, they will eat it happily and eagerly, which is part of our problem. But they need to have access to it. And so you can see in the bottom picture there, it is a cage floor, it is a wire floor on the bottom, but we leave paper on it. We leave the paper in for 3 to 4 weeks. That's how long it takes to do 3 full cycles of cocci recycling. And that will then allow enough of a buildup of the cocci oocysts to cause immunity. If you just vaccinate the birds, put them in a cage, or even put them in a barn where they can spread out too much and not have access to their droppings on a consistent basis, they won't develop immunity. And later on down the road, that'll turn into real problems with coccidiosis and necrotic enteritis. New housing systems, and this may be a surprise to a lot of people who aren't familiar with the industry. The bottom left picture is an aviary platform system. What happens is at day old chicks can only climb so much. They can't jump very high. As they get older, they become far more adept and far more inquisitive. So on the bottom picture there are a bunch of platforms that can be raised. So like you'll raise water lines to keep them at the correct height, we'll raise the pullet platforms so they learn how to navigate in 3 dimensions. They learn how to climb up, they learn how to get up on perches, they do all those things. The bigger picture on the right is also an aviary system. So the vast majority are actually almost exclusively, even though they're being raised in aviary systems, it's still a wire floor for the first 2 or 3 or 4 weeks of life, depending on how the system is set up. That's important because you need to keep the birds close to feed and water. If they can get away too far when they're not able to navigate back up into the system, you'll end up with birds that will starve to death because they don't have access to feed and water. So even though these birds are being raised in an aviary system, we still need to manage the coccidiosis vaccine, and we still need to manage the birds similar to the way they were raised in cages. Inside of that system, with all that looks like cages, there are perches, and there are different things that allow them to learn how to climb and move in three dimensions. But it'll be 4 or 5 weeks a lot of times before that front of that system is opened up, and then the birds have access to the entire barn and will climb up and down and go all around. Light technologies. And again, this is something that as we have the ability to control and measure, we're discovering a whole lot of things that when I first started my laying hen career wasn't even on the horizon as information we even needed. We knew that if we grew the birds on a certain day length and then increased it, they would come into production if they were old enough, and that was about it. That was what we needed to know, and that's all we did know. Since then, there's been an explosion of technologies with the new LED lights, the ability to control. It started off with CFLs, with the compact fluorescent lights, which are surprisingly odd. I think these are CFLs. So all the light that we have in this room, it's not coming through the windows, is actually given in 3 wavelengths. So there's a green piece, a blue piece, and a red piece, I think. Anyway, there's 3 colors, whatever those colors are. In our eyes, when they come together, they make white light, and it looks pretty much like it'll look outside. Chickens have a far bigger spectrum of light, of vision. They can see far into the ultraviolet and a little ways into the infrared. This does not look like white light to a bird. Okay, there's been lots of research done on that, and especially turkeys don't like compact fluorescent lights. Interestingly, when we use LED lights, now you get a full spectrum again. So instead of just the 3 wavelengths coming out, now we have the entire wavelength, including into the infrared and ultraviolet. So all of a sudden, the birds, even though the light intensity to us looks the same, the light intensity is much higher because they're absorbing and using all of that light that we're not even seeing. So we've had to adapt to light intensity levels, but because of the need for us to use light to stimulate these birds to start laying, day length's very important, and how we shorten their day length and lengthen their day length so they come into production like they should. We've also found that light intensity is very important for these long-lived birds. Broiler chickens are very quick to turn over. So you have a little wee yellow chick, and then you turn around and they're going to slaughter. And then you put little yellow chicks in your barn again, and all of a sudden they're leaving again. The turnover is very quick. So a lot of the behavior patterns, a lot of the pecking order doesn't establish. They also have behavioral differences because of their biology. They're just more sedate birds. Laying hens will develop a real serious competition amongst themselves. And like I said before, they don't play nice. So if they have a bird that they can take advantage of, they really will. So with intensity, we can control their aggression. With light color, we can control their aggression. And I don't know if anyone's really noticed this. I put some LED lights in my house. I wasn't paying attention. So the ones that I have in my upstairs hallway are really blue. And when I turn that light on, it's like you're walking into a spaceship. It just looks really, really different. If you put that into a laying hen barn, or you put that into a layer pullet barn, they will not respond well to it. It's the kind of thing that they'll really get agitated. They'll really become aggressive. And so we need to use warmer lights that makes them they just respond to it much differently. And then the flicker rate as well. We end up dimming the lights quite a bit. And when you take a light that uses as little energy as the LEDs do, you're talking about, and I don't know the exact numbers, but you're going from 0.1 ohms to 0.15 ohms is increasing your light intensity by 50%. So when you're doing that fine tuning, when you're getting down to say 30 or 40% light intensity, you can actually be so close to zero that you shut them off. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to get this to work, but does it give me the chance? No? See this one? I was able to get it to work at home.
Try bringing your mouse all the way over to the right. Keep going, keep going, keep going, keep going. Yep, now see if you can click on there. We'll do it.
On here?
Yep.
Nope. All right. So all that was showing, and it was relatively interesting, at least it was to me, is that the red lights there. We have a camera that we can really slow down the motion. We can't see nearly with the acuity that the birds can, and so it looks like just a solid light to us, but really it's a real slow flicker on and off, and they perceive that, and it really bothers them. The flock on the right with the whiter light was actually a regular speed, and you could see the pulse. So again, that's the kind of thing that with a long-lived bird, they develop behavioral habits the same as we do. And so if they start to become an agitated, excited flock, that will last through their entire lives. And they will just be jumpy all the time. They'll be aggressive to each other. They'll lose feathers. And so that ends up causing a whole lot of problems going on. So we need to be very attentive to our light technology, especially for the first 6 months of their lives, but all through that pullet life. The other thing is we need, like Scott was talking about with the broilers, for the first little while we need really bright lights to encourage these birds to find feed and water. And interesting with the elaborate housing that we have, you can herd birds with light, which is really cool. So we have set up different systems where, in an aviary barn, there will be lights on over top of the litter, and then there'll be lights on right by the nest or the system, and there'll be lights underneath underneath the system, so they're on the floor but underneath the cage or the aviary part. If you turn those lights off underneath the aviary part, they all come out into the middle. Then if you turn the lights off over top of the litter, they all start climbing up into the system. And so we use that at night to get the birds all up to sleep in the system, up on their perches and up near feed and water. But you can absolutely push birds around all over the place. And if you accidentally have a spotlight somewhere in your barn where there's a bright spot, we've had birds that will actually cause mortality because they all want to come and see the light, and they end up piling on each other and smothering. So it's another case of just don't go to the light. Now we get to disease challenges, and unlike Marina's talk, this is not so much a case of birds dying as little chicks. We are very successful with growing our day-old chicks and up to 2 or 3 weeks. We actually have more problem with having too much livability for our quota system, and then we have excessive chicks at the end of the pullet grow period because not as many would die as we had expected. But we have a lot of physiological stress when those birds start to lay, so almost all of our vaccinations and our health management stuff that happens in the pullet area, especially in the first week, is to protect the laying hens when they're mature. So there's, again, coccidiosis, we talked about that. It's very, very rare that I see necrotic enteritis or serious cocci in pullets. It's the kind of thing that will kill laying hens if the pullet vaccination doesn't work well. False layer syndrome is a fascinating and frightening disease where if you get bronchitis, which is pretty ubiquitous across eastern Canada, if it gets into the birds in the first 3 to 4 weeks of age, it actually gets attracted to the reproductive system, which is kidney tissue embryologically, and it will destroy it so that their actual oviduct doesn't form. So you can see the top bird there has a great big cyst. I mean, that's probably not quite the size of a volleyball, but getting there. And it's inside this bird. You can see all the yolks in the top right. That bird is sexually mature. She's ready to lay eggs. She's got all the processes going on to lay eggs. And that tube is blocked. So the oviduct is blocked. So you can see it fills up with what is the same consistency as egg white. Okay, so all the galled cells, all the pieces that are supposed to be happening do, but they can't get out of the bird. So that bird will never lay an egg, never has, never will. You can see on the bottom one, and does this have a pointer? Gotcha. So if you look here, there's a part of this oviduct that is not formed, and there's a little cyst right here. And there's a little cyst right here. Okay, so this is the same problem. It's just that the deformation of this oviduct is above the point where it's secretory. So there's no secretion of all this fluid, and so it'll still just run out through the vent and it'll be excreted by the bird. But this bird also will not lay any eggs. She's got yolks, she's sexually mature, and you can see there's free yolk in her abdomen. Long story short is that we end up with flocks of chickens that at the end of 6 months of growth, only 2/3 of them will ever lay an egg. And that's just a disaster to any of the producers. So this is something that we're working on trying to fix. The problem is birds are not especially immunocompetent in the first couple of weeks of life. So we're doing biosecurity, we're doing vaccinations, and we're really crossing our fingers a lot. We're trying to learn more about this disease, but it's kind of new, and there's a lot of things we don't know detail-wise about this. So at the end of the day, we're very successful in starting chicks. There are a lot of pullet barns that are, at the end of 19 weeks, have less than 2% mortality out of all the birds that are put in there. The industry is constantly changing. We have different challenges all the time, and that'll continue forever. But the principles are always the same. Like Scott says, you got to ask the birds what they want, and then you got to give it to them. So if there's any questions, I can take them now. I won't be able to hang around for the panel. I've got to actually go to a farm. But if there's any questions, I'll do my best.
Just on the light, because you guys know the light with the
Mhm.
light. Can you say Kelvin rating puts into a certain range of light emission from LEDs?
Not off the top of my head. So the question is, what's the right temperature for the light to be? So the right color of light, and we measure it in kelvins. I know that answer, but not in my brain right now, and I can sure get it to you. There is a real range, and it's to the redder end of the LED lights, but I wouldn't want to give you a number right now.
So what I would say is the lower number is better for layers and the higher number is better for grow out of the blue, green, and then the red of the strip. But
I've seen research. I've seen quite a bit of stuff in the literature about very controlled pen trials and whatnot. I haven't seen much of a difference in the field. I have seen there's research that shows that the compact fluorescent lights, what the technology we've moved away from, doesn't stimulate birds to lay very well. But we raised all of our birds for the last 15 years on them, and they laid very well. So I think the changes are probably enough that they can be measured and noticed in a controlled experimental situation. But I don't know that there's enough consistency across the industry. I don't see a measurable effect from barn to barn, despite having, at least 200 different lighting systems, across the province. So the changes are subtle, but I wouldn't bank real heavily on it from what I've seen.
Thank you, Dr. Petrik.
Thanks.